So I'm always interested naturally in how the media depicts addiction and recovery. And there were certainly decades where every time you saw anybody on television like Murphy Brown or millions of people, they were like in recovery and in AA, and that was just it. Um, Everybody knew that was the only thing to do. And what's happened lately, I mean, there are two major things that are happening. There are a proliferation of channels, and times change. And no matter, AA is still remarkably dominant, and I'm going to return to that. But it's not dominant the way it once was. Everybody doesn't naturally assume it's AA or you're dead. And so, for example, the Queen's Gambit, I saw on Netflix. I enjoyed it. It won a lot of awards, which surprised. I mean, I didn't know it was that prominent. The thing that surprised me about that was it's a story of natural recovery.
It really is, isn't it?
And not one person, except for you and me, mentioned that. Why do you think that is that not one person said, oh, well, nobody's going to say, oh, I'm glad they showed her getting over her addictions without AA and NA. Nobody's going to say that. But nobody even said, oh, I was surprised she didn't go to AA and NA and she got over her addictions.
That's not a concept someone would recognize. I mean, that's not something somebody would know to call a name or care about.
I guess the absence of something is hard to comment on.
Yeah, right.
I wasn't there. Let's talk about it.
It's like David Foster Wallace's "This Is Water" commencement speech.
Right.
You know what I mean?
No.
Yeah.
And so we have a incredibly valuable, none of our colleagues who are, some of them considerably more famous than us, I'll tick their names off as I always do, Maya Salovitz or Sally Sattel or Mark Lewis or the great Carl Hart, would ever pick up on something in the media and with their broader audience say, look, here's an example of something that's not a disease. It's almost as though they don't want to engage.
Right.
When I engage, but we're not even, we're not dropping a bucket. Dropping the ocean maybe a little too minuscule. But to get back to the Gambit, I saw it quite a while ago now. She had trauma. She was adopted away. Her adoptive father didn't want her. Her adoptive mother got involved with her, but she was herself addicted to medications. And then the girl was a great chess player. And then she went through various experiences. She didn't really have intimate relationships. And she went really far in chess and then had some failures and then crashed. And it turns out that she'd been taking pills all along and maybe drinking badly. And she crashes to the very bottom. I mean, she's just like laying around her house like a totally having given up. And then from that point, she resurrects herself through a combination of her skills and her community. Some of her even like a former boyfriend pitches in. They coach her up. They're her entourage for going to the big world championship in chess, and she ends up the world champion and, apparently stable lifestyle, although she never did get to an intimate relationship. And, I'm just marveling at that. And I'm thinking, it's just great that they're showing this on television now, or I don't know, they're streaming it, however you refer to it. And I always want to call. And so I'm distressed that nobody says, look, look what they're showing. This is happening. But I guess another way of looking at it is to say, well, look, they just show it on television and nobody, they don't pick at the network.
Mm-hmm.
And, and people just say, oh, that's what happened. It makes sense. She regained her skills with the support of friends. It was a great story, but that's just life. Maybe that's how I should view it. And so a book that was a bestseller, which I haven't read, but I did watch every element of every 10 episodes of the series, is called Maid. And there are two aspects of how to think about recovery. One is, how does the person themselves use substances? And of course, everything about the normalization of drug and alcohol use is anti-disease. It's saying, well, look, here's this addictive substance, but she uses it normally. And so the woman in Maid is, she's away from her home. She's in a series of she's in an abusive personal relationship with her husband, and her mother's completely, to use the Yiddish word, verchatted, at loose ends. She loves her, but she's just psychotic. And, she's living off, she has a child, she's just living off the land, and she's homeless. Because it was just a series of horrible events, but she drinks normally throughout it.
I haven't seen it yet. I haven't done my homework, so I'm going to be listening firsthand, and I'll be able to ask you questions that a listener might ask along the way.
Good.
I'll trust you.
I wanted to prep you for watching it. You'll probably pick up different things. So, for example, she sort of becomes an expert in filling out forms, because to get government aid, that's a big part of the book in the movie. You have to fill out a lot of forms. And then she eventually applies for writing scholarship and to go to the University of Montana. And every time she's filling something out, she's drinking a beer. And I'm worried
they're going to get...
Oh, she's an alcoholic.
Yeah.
No, she's having a beer while she's filling out the forms, and then she gets a scholarship and goes to the University of Montana at the very end. Sorry to spoil it for everybody.
So what's
and she's been traumatized up and down by every means possible. Her family's completely unreliable, including her mother, who kind of loves her, and her father even shows up at the end, but that's the next story. And I guess there's an ironic subplot. The term AA and 12 steps are never mentioned. Her mother is psychotic. In the review in the Times, they call her bipolar. And I mentioned to you, bipolar is now everything. Bipolar now means mental disorder.
Yeah.
They just say everybody's bipolar. And boy, that goes from moody teenage girls. And her mother, Amy McDowell, is portrayed as psychotic. She has barely a grasp on reality, but she's a sort of generous-hearted person, but totally at loose ends, can't control her life, and is always being manipulated by men, which turns out to be a major part of the plot.
Can I ask a question that'll divert from this for just a minute? Do you think there's any meaningful bipolar diagnosis? We're not diagnostic types of people, but do you think that there's a certain subset of behavior that you could say, all right, let's call this bipolar and work with it, that would be meaningful? Because if so, I would say that the broad reach of that term bipolar would take away from that client. You know what I mean? Where there's someone who said, you say, wow, sharp contrast, crazy mania, or deep depression.
Anybody is bipolar?
Have I? No, I'm not much for diagnostics. I'm just saying, is there any sense to one at any level?
I happen to, in a past life, I was a licensed psychologist, and I've worked in institutional settings where I had to provide diagnostic codes. So I have a working familiarity with DSM.
Right.
So I know how to do a code and a diagnosis. In real life, I think we've discussed this. You and I share never using diagnoses.
Yeah.
Describing people's behavior. I mean, I know but most of the people I know, first of all, they're older. And so they're not totally into that. And then secondly, they're not into the diagnostic world. Although Archie works in a forensic setting. But so we never swap, but you knew Walter Ann, who was much older. It would never occur to her to say, oh, that person's bipolar or OCD. She would never just say that. She would just describe them in English terms, which is what I prefer to do, because at its best, a diagnostic label is always going to clip something out.
Right.
You're always because that's why you write a whole thing. You say, well, they're OCD with traces of anxiety disorder, and they don't fulfill it 100% because they're a little, and that's what you're always trimming it. And so it's simpler if you're actually dealing with a human being to just say, well, here's their behavior and their mood. And let's return her mother. I mean, I actually did start thinking, well, what would the diagnosis of her be? Yeah.
It's kind of fun to do that game. Even yeah.
And bipolar is a mood disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, they use the term now on television, bipolar depression, which is already, it used to be called anxiety depression disorder, and then bipolar includes
manic depression. Yeah.
Now they have bipolar depression. You're going, wait a second, we skipped it's anxiety depression.
It's retroactive.
And so she didn't have a mood disorder. She had a psychosis. She just couldn't perceive reality, except every once in a while, her daughter, the maid, like she would give her a video of one of her boyfriends renting out her house. And eventually she said, no, he would never do that. And you're thinking, well, that's what he did. And eventually she does present it to him. So, but she drinks and smokes marijuana, and she uses it as a kind of a tool or a crutch. But the film, this is remarkable, never portrays that as her problem. She's just semi-psychotic or borderline. It's almost, I would almost go so far as to say they feel that alcohol and marijuana are reasonable crutches for her, but they never portray her as having a substance problem. So there's the maid and her mother, Amy McDowell, and the woman playing her daughter's actually in real life her daughter. Is her name Woolley? Anna Woolley, perhaps. And she has a husband, the father of her daughter. And he never, they spend a ton of time in the book, and because I've read things by her, and in the movie saying, does he abuse her? Because he doesn't actually hit her. He throws things close to her and the glass shatters. So that's actually a discussion point. To me, that's a waste. That's in law, if you threaten somebody physically, that's called assault.
Mm-hmm.
Don't actually, that's just the way it is. I was a lawyer in New Jersey. They had degrees of assault. And if you go up to somebody and put your face in there saying, I'm going to kick your ass, that's some degree of assault. I mean, it's not as bad as if you beat them to an inch of their life. So, and when he does that when he gets drunk, and throughout the film, there are three people who mention recovery, and they use the term, they don't say, oh, I'm going to AA. They all say, I'm going to a group. And those three people are, who at times is not a bad guy. He's never portrayed as being anything but a good father. And whenever he goes off track and ruins her life one way or another, either by threatening her or she gets a fabulous location. She's homeless and she gets a great place to live. And her husband and a bunch of people show up for a party, her daughter's third birthday party, and he gets drunk in the living room and falls asleep and wrecks it. And then the people say, you know, you're going to have to move. And she begs them, the maid, can I just stay here? And they say no. So one way or another, he's a total albatross around her neck. And I don't know, 5 or 10 times he says, well, I'm going to a group now. And then you're sort of saying, huh. And if you're thinking, well, maybe this is some kind of a 12-steppy thing, that'll be good, but it's never good. He's constantly screwing up. And you never get the feeling, well, for example, with Ron Howard's brother, well, he got involved in drugs and alcohol, and Ron said, oh, so when he started going to groups, you know, I supported him. That didn't sound like it went that well either. It sounded like it took quite a long time. But here in Maid, it's like bullshit. Then there are two other people. The men in this movie are not a good group. So the guy who's stealing, her mother has one asset in life that's gotten her through life, resource-wise. She owns a house that she rents out. He rents it out around her. And what does he do with the money he gets? He blows it on gambling. And so at one point, the maid, her mother, Amy McDowell, and her husband, actually, I think, show up and confront the guy at a gambling casino. They're kicking him out of the gambling casino. He's such a bum that he's not even acceptable in a gambling casino. And when he gets out, he says, well, I have a gambling problem, you know, a gambling addiction, but I'm going to a group. And by this point in the movie, you're both in terms of him and in terms of groups, you're going, oh, sure, big effing shit, you know, group and a dime. The saying used to be, that and a dime will get you a cup of coffee.
Right, right.
But the most perplexing figure in a way is her father. I mean, there is a trauma element in the movie where the maid figures out that she meets her father again. He's 100% helpful, and he's got a very nice wife. She has a lot of needs because she's trying to get a job and work, and she's got a daughter. And her husband's unreliable. And her father and her stepmother are always there for her. But ultimately, she won't cut him a break because he beat her mother. Crazy Amy. And she seems prepared to almost forgive her husband for his near assaults or his version of assaults, but she won't cut her father a break for assaulting her mother. And it shows her hiding in a cupboard being traumatized. And eventually she leaves her husband because she finds her daughter hiding in a cupboard being traumatized. Now, if I had a problem with the film, it was she couldn't be thinking things were going well for her daughter before she remembered that she was traumatized. Beaten. They're moving from one place to another. Her husband's getting drunk and throwing bottles. they can't count on anybody. And they're homeless. I mean, people overcome those things all the time, but that's what finally makes her, I don't know what, because all along she's sort of striving to get out of the situation, but she'll never forgive her father. And her father goes to groups. So her father he says, oh, my wife will pick her up because I have to go to a group. And he goes to groups religiously.
So going to groups is not only not seen as not helpful, but it's not even seen as a showing of good faith that he's trying to do something.
It's not even redemptive.
Right.
She never says, good point, well, now he's in a group, so okay, I'm going to forgive him for his past transgressions. She never says that. And it's always used as the kind of a thing of coddling her husband. Her father, biological father, goes to groups with her husband and says, I'm really trying to help you out by doing that. And she doesn't buy that either. That doesn't work for her either. And in fact, this is a little hard for me to fathom. She holds it against her husband that her husband hangs around with her father. But in the movie, in her actual life, her father only does good things for her. When she has to move in the middle of the night, he shows up. I mean, I'm the last person on earth to say, I'm going to give you your 20-year chip and your life is good. Everything's forgiven. Everything going forward's okay. But her father does a version of that, but she never cuts him a break on that. So we have groups mentioned by three people. Her husband, unreliable, who never shapes up. Her father, who's become a reliable human being, a mensch, but who she'll never forgive. And that bum who her mother was hanging out with, who lost her only asset in life, her only perch in life, her house. And so, and meanwhile, she and her mother use substances. They never show her smoking marijuana. And they're normal. Well, her mother's not normal, but, it's a kind of like a Carl Hart line. Drugs are not her problem, and alcohol is not her problem. And the maid is a normal substance consumer. And there's really not a scene where she doesn't drink. Every time she's trying to conk something out and fill out a form, she'll have a beer. She kind of drinks at parties. And once or twice, when things are really going bad, she'll drink too much. And in some romantic situation, drinks wine. I can only assume that in real life, she's a normal human being that has had a range of experiences with a range of varieties of alcohol. And that got translated into the film. Now, when you say it gets translated into the film, you have to say two things. You have to say, well, it was in the original work. And then whoever produced and directed this film said, well, okay, that's true, probably, because they drink normally,
So there's a certain mise en scène that the director had to portray, yeah.
Right. And so, Maid seems to be, I don't know if it's going to gather all the awards that the Queen's Gambit gathered. It's very highly ranked. It was I don't know if it was a #1 bestseller, but the book immediately shot up to be a bestseller in the New York Times. And it's one of the top-rated, perhaps the top-rated Netflix film. So, hope springs eternal. I'm just thinking that it's seeping into American consciousness. You don't watch that film and say, oh, if my boyfriend or husband goes through AA, we're in like Flynn, everything's solved. That's going to be the solution. If anything, really make groups a hideout, an excuse, and papering over of things. It went pretty far down that road.
So meanwhile, you have the movie Dope Sick. Have you heard of that with Michael Keaton? And I haven't even seen it.
I haven't.
But I like to think we're trending in this direction where to portray things accurately, you have a certain sort of a class that you're trying to portray accurately. And so they're having a beer once in a while. They might drink a little too much now and then, but you're not going to, there's no archetype of the junkie or addict that you have to do.
But this is like
I wonder
of, and there've been a million of them. The Man with the Golden Arm.
Yeah, now, this is one of those. Yeah.
There's one thing I believe I'm known for regarding drugs and alcohol in the same bailiwick, in the same basket. And everybody who comments on those things says they should be in the same basket, but they're not. And so, when people talk about drug deaths and they talk about overprescription of pills, and of course, when they talk about heroin, they're not thinking about alcohol. And I point that out with Carl. Carl's almost going like, well, alcohol's normal, but it can be an addictive drug. Think about heroin the same way. And it's almost like that's a completely novel idea that you have to sort of persuade people by.
Right.
So in Gen, you're not going to see in Mayor of Easttown, thank you. And in Maid, you'll see people drinking normally. See people smoking. They didn't show anybody smoking marijuana normally, including Maid. They still haven't got there. I think in Succession, they might show people smoking marijuana normally and drinking alcohol normally, I think. They're not going to show anybody in our lifetimes, forget me, your lifetimes, shooting up heroin normally. They're not going to have the Carl Hart story showing him shooting up and then going to a faculty meeting at Columbia. That's not
without that being some pivotal understanding of the character as having a dark rooted sort of a place in his psyche, right? Right.
You're gonna have to. Well, then Carl's not going to sign off on it. Unlike Unlike our good friend Johan, who just signed off on a version of his story. About the singer drug addict. He didn't care. Carl's not going to do that. He's not going to we're just making this whole thing up. I know of no movie deal or whether there could be such a thing where they're going to make Carl Hart have a dark underpinning and he's taking heroin to overcome the trauma of his ghetto upbringing. And he only thinks he's a normal person. Nobody.
Right, exactly.
Said that to Carl. Carl doesn't invite that kind of let me reinterpret your life for you, liberty. They're not going to show people generally taking painkillers or amphetamines, forget heroin, and they're okay or normal. They're not going to do that in my lifetime or yours. Go on.
You don't think so? I think it could happen.
Well, they do. They do show people. Well, of course, they show people taking prescriptions all the time. And like in Maid, her mother's supposed to be taking drugs, but they don't tell you which drugs she's supposed to be taking that are good. They're not going to go down that road. Maybe when they do the Adi Jaffe story, they'll show speed, meth or amphetamines. They don't. Do they even show people taking Adderall as a positive? Not as. They don't show people taking the drug. They'll sort of say, "Oh, he's being treated for adult."
Right.
ADHD.
Right.
They don't actually show them taking Adderall.
Yeah, that's a good point. As of now, we have no ability to reconcile normal drug use, like with heroin, with methamphetamines, as something that you could portray somebody middle class doing, or somebody who doesn't have an extreme character flaw doing in media.
And
Maybe
having
that'll
the
be
consequence of addiction. I mean, if Carl wanted to set some giant goal for himself, like I keep getting back to Carl, because Carl's a cultural figure that can't be attacked.
Yeah, yeah.
It would be, he would sign up with somebody like Joe Rogan to do a movie about a normal heroin. And there are tons of normal heroin use.
Well, let me say, so one thing he's been doing is he was interviewed by a lot of comedians about his book. And he said, he mentioned that he wanted that to happen because he's sick of he loves going to comedy shows, but he's so tired of them using this. It's not even funny when they make the stereotypical junkie archetype. It's like, come on, just do something funnier, because that's too easy. Plus, I'm the guy that's saying that drugs aren't the problem. It's just perpetuating this issue that I have. So he was interviewed by a ton of comedians, and he asked to do a lot of comedians' podcasts and shows so that he could explain that to them. And he was pretty good natured with them. And when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, he
tried to get the whole field to take in that input.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, well, in our world, they talk about all the people. What's the term that people talk about? They don't use the word oppressed groups. People of color, women, people with disabilities. They're groups that are stigmatized.
Mm-hmm.
And drug users is now in that category, at least in our drug policy reform world.
Right.
People talk about, they feel free to put down drug users. And Carl's talking about one variety of it. They're saying, well, there is no such thing as a normal person, drug user.
Right.
And so I guess the issue there is, when will that group be potent? And I mean, they have a Sunday morning, how do you spend your Sundays program. I sent you a copy of it.
Yeah, I just read that. That was very interesting.
And the head of DPA, Maria and Ethan's replacement, Kassandra Frederique. She didn't say anything in the interview about taking drugs herself. I wonder if they would have done that with Ethan, if he would have mentioned taking drugs.
I wonder if she mentioned taking drugs and they didn't include it. Or wouldn't have allowed her to include it.
We don't know the answer to that.
We couldn't possibly know.
That Kassandra is a person who's obviously aware of drug users being an outcast, stigmatized group. That's something the EPA knows about.
Of course.
Learned about. And now she's one of those people that they say, oh, how I spend my Sundays, which is sort of like, well, how the movers and shakers in New York, what do they do on Sunday compared to,
right.
what I do?
Some schlubs, yeah.
And so is she a power broker? And is she going to introduce into the discussion? Drug users are normal. They're the same range of normalcy of people as everybody else. Is that ever going to be said? By the way, when she didn't describe her work, but in like a couple of sentences. And she just says something like, which I think Ethan could have said, well, sometimes I get apprehensive. Obviously, I'm dealing with a major topic. And, I wanted to go right, and naturally, you have some apprehension. And she described, as I recollect, what she's dealing with as being addiction and drug policy. I don't think Ethan would have ever said that his mission was addiction. He said, oh, I'm dealing with complex things. Kassandra said, addiction and drug policy. I don't think Ethan would have ever put that in the mix. Addiction wasn't his bailiwick. His province was dealing with people, their drug use in regards to society and the legal framework.
So was Ethan kind of like would you put him in the same frame as like you put Carl in his incompleteness to have an addiction conceptualization?
Ethan's job, Ethan's not a psychologist.
No, not in that sense, but in the same, but you know what I mean? Like if you're going to run an organization like the DPA, you might have someone on board who's an addiction specialist and put that as, you name that as one of your sole focuses.
I don't have any, I think in my life I've communicated with Kassandra. Kassandra wasn't the person who arranged for you to do the book thing at the last conference, was she? It was somebody else.
No, it was someone else. It was, I'll think of it in a second.
I think I've dealt with Kassandra over time. In the past, we don't communicate now. My bottom line in my memoir is Ethan made this deal with the devil and me. Ethan said, Stanton's going to keep confronting people about the disease theory. That's only going to screw up my mission of getting drugs to be dealt with in a public health framework. I mean, Ethan, I'm not some giant 12-step abstinence buff. I'm the opposite. Mm-hmm. But they're going to be part of what I want to replace ever putting people in jail. But I'm not going to take that. So I'm not going to take that on. It'll only piss off some people who should be my allies. And as I always said to Ethan, name one ally you got from the 12-step world that really made a difference. You know,
what was it? He couldn't do that?
There is nobody. Ted Kennedy's son was the biggest opponent to legalizing marijuana. He was always telling me he was going to get a guy I know, William Cope Moyers out of Hazleton, Betty Ford, on board because he's somewhat loosey-goosey. He never came out. The best defense of Ethan is to say his mission was to replace the criminal justice system as a way of dealing with people who use drugs.
Absolutely.
That's his mission. That's his job. Yeah. And my critique of Ethan, which I'm making, and I make in my memoir, and I'll make until I die, is he missed the boat. You can't, because he says, so I'm specifically not going to tackle this whole disease bullshit thing. How is that going to do anything for me? And he missed the boat because viewing addiction as a disease is the most fundamental underlying. You're not going to get normalization of drug use, which we started out talking about. If people say, oh, or Carl, the reaction Carl gets, oh, well, heroin causes disease. You can't use drugs normally like heroin. And whatever drugs sort of resemble heroin, which is, depends who you are. Does that include cocaine? And so the disease concept is bigger than the public health model. It carries more of society's prejudices and is more harmful. And so Ethan threw out the baby with the bathwater or something. He picked the wrong goal. And in his defense, where would he have gotten if he would have spent all his time fighting the disease theory in AA? He could say, I wouldn't have gotten done what I got done. But where Ethan is wrong is Ethan's now Stanton. You've got a, preoccupation that runs through your work and your life of being concerned with only one thing, addiction and the disease of addiction. And my answer to him is that's what it's going to end up all being about. And just to tie the other loose end, when I saw Kassandra Frederique being interviewed, and she said, oh, I've got a lot to deal with complexity-wise. I'm dealing with addiction and drug, and the addiction was first. It's possible that Kassandra, as I said, I had no contact with her, will be will end up being more in tune with where the universe needs to go for reform than Ethan.
I think so. Yeah, and there's been other evidence of this so far too, in like articles that you've mentioned. She mentioned what was the thing that we were talking about?
Redefined harm reduction.
Right, the redefining of harm reduction. Right.
Out something which was, she says, harm reduction isn't technique A or B.
That's right.
Jane.
That's right.
Harm reduction is a whole approach to drug use, and you see how that ties into
and to life. She said.
Yes.
Right. So. Okay.
So we've got, even though Ethan would make a point of eventually inviting me to every drug policy conference that he ran. Kassandra doesn't seem to have been tempted to do that. I have high hopes that perhaps outside of my involvement, she's going to move the ball down the road in a way that he did. Well, we covered, we covered bipolar diagnosis. We covered the Queen's Gambit. We covered Maid. We covered how does society view AA and 12-step groups in natural recovery. Is there a change? Are people beginning to shift their views? And you and I ended up saying, boy, it's going to be a tough haul on the drug front. And then we ended up enjoying Kassandra Frederique's, little clues that she gave on her Sundays in New York.
Lastly, if I were a gambling man, I'm not really, but if I had to put money on it, you wager that in our lifetimes, mine or yours, we're not going to see cinema portraying somebody who uses heroin as somebody who's doing it normally. It's not going to be a normal person. And I'm going to bet against you, and I don't know what we're betting, but hopefully it'll happen. But the shift in there's almost sort of a retro kind of a shift back to people can drink and do things like smoke or use marijuana normally, and it doesn't have to be a huge character development thing. It's just something that they do that shows a sort of what's the term, mise en scène, like this is normal for this kind of class of person. I think we could move on to.
Can you think of one movie where somebody normal snorts cocaine?
Currently, no, but I'm saying that I think something that might be happening is that people who are tasked with directing or producing films, they want to get something that's actually linking on to what people are understanding in their everyday lives in society. And so one way or another, especially as we go more independent with things, we got YouTube and different streaming channels. I'm going to bet that there are going to be types of cinema that include people who use drugs in a sort of normal way.
An example, and I wrote about it for Filter. The movie about the two comedians. You can't remember. You don't happen to remember the name of it.
It's not Hacks.
Hacks. I guess Hacks refers to the fact that if you're kind of a comedian, you're a hack. Hacks is it. And the younger woman, representing new generation, I think she goes off on some new type drug binges. It's not smoking marijuana. And she gets some painkillers for the older woman, but that's because the older woman was paid. So maybe, So anyhow, that does heroin though.
I don't know. We'll see. But we're on. This is episode 53. That means we've done this 53 consecutive weeks, which is pretty crazy. That's over a year. So that means last year we hit a 1 year anniversary of the show, which I forgot. I didn't really realize.
How reliable are the two of us to actually manage to show up in the midst of all the turmoil, Donald Trump, whatever else the hell is going on?
We put out a show every single week.
He gets sick. I'm an old man. Well, at least there's some constancy in the universe. God bless.
But by episode 100, we'll see which way the wind is blowing, right. And we'll return to our bet. All right, Stanton. Thanks
See you
again.
later now.